Fantastic. Let's talk about all things Azure security across the lens of roughly 10-ish years. I'm cheating a little bit here because it stretches a little bit more than a decade. So it's kind of a floating 10 years in here. But this is a very fun session to do, at least for me, because it's a very personal story. I can pick my own personal pet peeves and maybe some of the good stuff as well when it comes to security, and both available controls, what could you have done throughout these years in Azure, and also what were the limitations, what was the outer or upper bound of security, what could you do in Azure across the years. So I have another title slide, third title slide. So my name is Karl. I'm coming to you from Switzerland. My accent is coming to you from Finland. If you're into rally, formula, whatnot, you might be familiar with that one, so apologies for that. I'm heading cloud security at EPAM Systems, a consultancy. I have all of those different acronyms out there that we all love and learn. I have an Azure book out. As with any books with cloud security, you might know that when it hits the presses, it's already out of date, but it's still a fun one to check out as well. I also have a couple of courses at LinkedIn Learning. Personally, I've been a consultant on Azure space and Azure security space from the very beginning, and that's why this is a very personal story to me as well, because it's basically what did I see, what was the client discussion, what was the de facto set of capabilities on the cloud across these years. And also, while we are building this up towards the current state, you might also see if you came into cloud, or if your organization or your client's organization, if you're a consultant, if you came into Azure at any of those points in time, you might see that the decisions or the architecture that you picked might be derailed, or might have some lucky directions based on where you started off. So with that, let's get started. And this is how Azure or Windows Azure looked like 10 years ago. This was all about, well, actually, there was a bunch of different portals. This was a great portal. This is a new portal because you didn't have to use Silverlight to use it. So this was based on something called HTML5, and you could even use other browsers than just IE to actually use it. But it was still very wonky. Everything was right-click deploy. There was only one level of access, full access. At some point, you could start to actually share it with other users as well, but everyone got the full level of access. You could be admin or co-admin, but it didn't really matter. You had full create, read, update, delete access into your cloud environment. You could kick anyone out. You could invite anyone in. It was all based on the Live ID or Microsoft accounts or personal accounts that you had in there. And if you deployed something from a machine, then you had actually, by default, you had self-signed certificates that also were added as users or machine users into that same Azure subscription, which those management certificates were a bit of a pain a few years later when those automatically created credentials or certificates actually were due for renewal. And if you had your pipelines over out there that were still running and using those, then that would have been actually the breaking factor for you there. But this is what we had in Azure. Everything was internet connected by default. So for your convenience, you had access to everything, and everyone had access to you and your applications in the cloud as well. Actually, only 2013 we got this service called ACLIS. We actually got introduced to some sort of access control list, and even NSGs a little bit later, that we could actually start setting some sort of limitations there. It was all quite disconnected, a little bit manual, but at least if you knew what you were doing, and if you wanted to do the right thing, you now started to have a little bit of possibility to actually limit down those ports, at least get rid of your management ports fully for the public internet out there. So getting a little bit better there. And across this journey, we started to have different types of services. By this time, by 2013, we didn't have any virtual machine type of services. Now 2014, Microsoft also realized that now these other clouds that are out there, they are doing this virtual machine thing, and clients didn't really want to get away from this kind of virtual machine mindset. So they kind of backstepped a little bit and brought us this virtual machine role or this infrastructure as a service capability. Now these virtual machines that you deployed, yes, they had been patched by Microsoft, or they had some sort of configuration built in, but now they were actually persistent as well. The state didn't really go away when there was a reboot cycle or any of these other operations that you didn't have any control of. So they started to feel a little bit more familiar. So at least what I saw was that a lot of clients started to bring existing familiar applications into the cloud as well, not just build new applications on top of the cloud. And that brought us some interesting features as well. Also, 2014, we started to see this neat thing called Azure AD. And I mentioned earlier, we had live accounts still as our main tool for logging in as administrators. Now we had Azure Active Directory Premium with some of very familiar functionality that we already still feel familiar with. So there were some anomalous sign-ins that we saw in there. You weren't really able to create conditional access rules based on this yet, but at least you got the information. You were able to log these things. You were able to find out if something was amiss, and you were able to turn on this MFA thing as well. Not a lot of other functionality at this point just yet, but still a very, very interesting functionality at this point. So the slides were a little bit out of order there. So apologies for that. So on the VMs that I just started to mention you about the 2 slides back, we also got introduced to some functionality about security adjacent topics. So with virtual machines, we got also introduced not just to the images that you could upload or pick from a gallery of a VM, but also some sort of different life cycle of extensions. So if you ever seen or heard about, check the box or checklist-based security, this is literally it. You check the box called Microsoft anti-malware, and then you're good. You have security in your virtual machine, and that was pretty much it. You couldn't really configure anything with it at this point. You picked from one of these vendors that were supported. A little bit later came in the functionality to actually export those logs away from that actual virtual machine itself. But at least at this point, you got a VM, and you were able to create some security-related logs inside that VM, and it was your job to actually take those logs away from that machine. And we got a little bit more upgrades already for this networking controls. Now that we weren't dealing just with, platform as a service components, we needed to get introduced to network security groups. We got virtual private networking. We got express route MPLS connectivity as well. This all went hand in hand with this adoption of not just BPOS, but also Microsoft Office 365 capabilities back then. At least how it looked to me at that point was most organizations that were using or implementing express route were doing that because of their requirements for M365 side of things, not necessarily for Azure's side of things. But they went hand in hand for a while. And if you've been around that world, you know that nowadays we don't just require, or Microsoft doesn't just require you to, they don't even recommend or almost support you to use express route for M365 components. So we've come quite a long way on that functionality as well. And just a year later, another portal. I didn't show you the silver portal there in the beginning, but we got introduced to yet another portal from this Azure Service Management into Azure Resource Management world. And this was actually a big change because behind the scenes, it was a full revamp of from this classic Azure into the real Azure that we know nowadays. We have templatized deployments, we have IAC. We actually got introduced to an enforced version of Azure Active Directory logins, no longer live accounts or these personal accounts that you will use to log into your core critical infrastructure. And we got introduced to the idea of role-based access control in Azure with a dozen or so built-in roles and functionality to even build your own roles, custom roles there as well. Not a lot of the functionality that we now know from a feature completion perspective was there, but the fundamental core building blocks came with this introduction of this new Azure portal or GA portal or ARM portal or EPAM portal or however you call it, many different names for the same product. And sort of separately, but now we start to already see some of these legacy problems within the cloud environment. We also got introduced to this functionality called Azure Key World. But Azure Key World was a service that provided us a solution for this new world of Azure, Azure Resource Manager, as well as this old world of Azure, Azure Service Management. So it needed to be available in both worlds. So you could, even if you deployed your virtual machines in the old world, you could still create, store and manage securely your secrets or encryption keys for your virtual machines in Azure Key World. So it had actually a completely separate, a third data plane access control method, this completely separate ACLI mechanism that was just living there for a long time, and it didn't actually use Azure Active Directory, despite being natively available in this Azure Resource Manager world. But in general, the fundamental approach of combining secret store, key store, and certificate store in one product was actually quite a neat and quite a fundamental component within this Azure landscape as well. And we even got introduced just a year later into a service that was then called Azure Security Center. And nowadays we call this Defender for Cloud, and for a long time it was quite a bit different from MDC. But at the announcement perspective, this was basically our way of pulling those logs out from the virtual machines that we created into one centralized platform. So if the virtual machine itself was decommissioned or something else happened to it, you will still have those logs in a centralized place, and you were able to have dashboards and reports. They didn't really do much more. There was a little bit of prioritization that you see in here, but basically you got every possible update, the missing updates, every possible security configuration listed in there. And it was just a huge amount of information that was displayed to you for a centralized user perspective. It wasn't super usable or actionable for a kind of individual application development teams or individual kind of subscription teams perspective yet. And moving on, almost halfway through our years here. So 2017, not a lot of individual updates or individual services, but a lot of small things that made our lives a little bit better. Stuff was catching up into the announcements that were made a few years earlier, not just promiseware, but actually implementable. We got into general availability into a lot of these services, and then we got introduced to a couple of very core fundamental pieces that were becoming very useful later on as well. So managed identities, of course, we got this capability now to create machine identities that were useful outside of the lifecycle of a service principal or something that's quite disconnected from a user perspective. This is something that you will create yourself as a user assigned managed identity and assign it without needing to manage some sort of credentials, either secrets or certificates yourself. And crucially, in an enterprise environment, this means that you didn't need to give your developers access into your Azure AD to create those identities as well. As you know, either you put this behind the process at that time, or you were a bottleneck from your centralized IT or IAM team perspective, or if you gave that self-service access to your developers, that basically meant this kind of humongous mass of service principals, unmanaged credentials that had a lot of power into not just your Azure environment, but also through SSO into multiple different business applications as well. That's where like Solorigate and this happened later on as well, by having those service principals that were created in this very self-service way. So managed identities were introduced to create a different way of giving a developer self-service tooling to create identities to these machines or applications to have access to. And also a way of getting rid of credentials from code as well. So getting rid of connection strings and other type of credentials in our code, and actually taking those into Azure native identity components. Then we got Custo KQL. So when Azure Security Center was announced a year earlier, it was built on something different. It had some built-in reports. It had a different query language. If you were using Operations Management Suite or OMS, you basically build stuff by hand in there. And then you needed to move to this new world of KQL a little bit later there. Quite important tool, as we later on learned with Sentinel and this other tooling, also third-party tooling, not just within Microsoft, became very quickly this kind of de facto query language across different Azure native components, not just monitoring components in there. And then Azure Policy was already announced, technically available in the Azure Resource Manager portal or Ibiza portal announcement, but became generally available and also gave us more functionality than just deny or audit capabilities in here. So we got a little bit of capability to create aliases. We were able to build our own policies, not just use some built-in policies out there. And then a couple of smaller announcements around that time that took a lot of time later to actually get be implementable or be maybe widely used. AZSK, not a real Microsoft product, but as Security Center was still not super useful it wasn't super actionable for end users. Microsoft themselves started to move their own workloads to the Azure and figured out that their own teams don't know what to secure and how to secure this cloud thing. So they actually built this PowerShell-based rules engine to teach their own and validate their own deployments. And that was put out there in GitHub, available for anyone to scan their own environments as well. Eventually, this was years later then kind of deprecated, and all of this functionality became part of the Defender for Cloud. But for a long time, there were these kind of two different worlds. If you were very infrastructure as a service oriented, or if you are very centralized team oriented, you maybe could do with Azure Security Center or your existing monitoring tools. And then if you're looking at platform as a service components, if you're looking at self-service type of, let's say, DevSecOps flow, then you would use AZSK or Secure DevOps Kit for Azure then. And then the first version of WAF and confidential compute for virtual machines were also announced on that time frame. Moving on, we got privileged identity management, just-in-time access, not just giving permanent access on role-based access control, but we got a tooling to actually implement on Azure side as well, not just on Office 365 side, our roles behind at least self-service or even requiring approvals, for I principle for activating these highly privileged roles. Very useful in enterprise environments. Later on, we got some more actionable insights and more self-service capabilities in the Defender, actually Security Center product. So we started to have this gamification. You got some points, you got some, color coding to help you build your help secure your cloud environment. If you were the only one, if you were the developer, the administrator, the security person, the tester, this is what at least what I was exposed to, this is what happened in a lot of cases. Either you were in this self-service-ish environment, or you were in this very hands-on, very tight environment, which was basically a bottleneck as well. So kind of the crown jewels were kind of very highly regulated or looked at, and you had that help available. But if you weren't part of the crown jewel applications, then quite often you were left to your own devices. And the self-service capabilities and this prioritization helped a lot, at least to gain visibility into that. How well are we doing? As a consultant, basically my job after this was just to come in to a client, and if I was doing an audit, it was basically asking them to log in with their own credentials, asking them to navigate to these pages and read out loud what should they be doing. That was basically pretty much the first workshop was exactly that. Great. And we also got some new functionality, bring your own key encryption. So we had technically for virtual machines with the Key World, we got some functionality to build disk encryption to use if we happen to use those specific encryption tools that supported that, but it wasn't available for platforms as a service, and most of the storage was not in Azure disks, but actually was in Azure storage accounts. So this was a big thing for actually getting some coverage into bring your own key encryption there. And the first platform as a service product to get that. And then Azure Sentinel, or Azure Sentinel, nowadays Microsoft Sentinel. Again, in the beginning, maybe not exactly as the product as we know nowadays, but at least it gave you the option now to keep all of your security, not just security hygiene, but also some of that operations capabilities within the cloud. You could do some correlation, you could do some log correlation. You didn't need to ship all of your logs out of the cloud in order to tap those into your security operations flows, which meant also that egress costs were lower, and you were able to build a cloud native environment for your monitoring and hygiene workflows as well. Of course, it still supported, you tapping into your existing SIEMs, but this was something that you could actually start conceivably do all of these bits in the cloud. And front door, one of the first services or security-related services that was not deployed to a specific region in Azure. This was actually something like, it's just there. You just open the front door and that's it. You just give us some metadata information. It's not up to you where do we deploy it. It's always closest to the client. It actually has more points of presence locations than just the data center regions that you are using for your other services. And you can then deploy some of your own configuration logic into these front door instances. So you got to do stuff like, let's deploy this web application firewall actually into the front door. Let's terminate all of that malicious traffic actually there, not using our own quite expensive capacity-based application gateway web application firewall. And you could do a little bit better routing. So if you had a global application, then you were able to route that traffic already at the source quite a bit earlier than in this previous products that you were using traffic manager or application gateway and so forth. And also Azure Bastion. It feels like a lot of the products that we nowadays have as part of our core functionality we're already start to already become available around this time. Azure Bastion, of course, gives us jump host as a service. Somewhat limitations, but already available for most of the scenarios that we needed it for, and it got even better. So great. And then not a product as such, but also when we started to use Azure more, we needed more tooling to actually talk to our GRC friends or external auditors that we actually knew what we were doing. So we had already now these technical capabilities to actually enforce, HTTPS, even enforce which version of HTTPS are maybe even what into the level of which cipher seeds are we using. And we had some functionality to secure our Azure environments from a technical control perspective, but we didn't have a shared language with our auditors. If you went to an established benchmark vendor that you had before and went to look for a hardening guide, those were released every year basically. So the hardening guide might not even had anything on the products that you wanted to use if the product was released half a year ago. And a lot of the services were introduced gradually first into private previews, then public previews and general availability. And as a user, if the service was already in a general availability, you felt like it was ready. But as a kind of auditor or as a benchmark vendor, you maybe only then started to look at those products. So there was a bit of asymmetry there. So Microsoft introduced this Azure Security Benchmark, which now has evolved, of course, to Cloud Security Benchmark, that kind of gives us this common language. These are the Azure technical security controls that we use, and this is the kind of standard set of broader or industry-specific regulation and frameworks and benchmarks that these technical security controls map into. So you had a little bit more guidance, and you had a little bit more than just an Excel sheet that you built yourself to kind of trying to frantically map stuff into controls and have that argument all over again every year with your IT general controls organization there. And it was provided by the vendor, so the mapping was by default already there. You didn't need to do it yourself, but you could export this as an Excel sheet. So if that's what your counterpart was doing, you were still able to have that shared language there. As a practitioner, this is one of the sad or not, this is one of the coolest features that we had in there. And private link and private endpoint. So also one of these features, like we had managed identities earlier, we had bring your own key. Private link and private endpoint started to become more and more available in not just available in one or two services, but actually available as a quality gate, a criteria for an Azure service to graduate into general availability at some point was around this time that you needed to have these Azure Security Benchmark controls available, you needed to have managed identity support, you needed to have private link support, and you needed to even have support for bring your own key. Now, if you're into federal government work or DoD work, you know that around this time there was a big contract with the JEDI contract that was kind of a big basis of those requirements. There were some further requirements that came in with hold your own key as well, but this did a lot of good, because now it wasn't just a separate security product group on Azure that had to do things around security, but now each of the product groups themselves were responsible of building these security capabilities in as well. So private link, if you're not familiar with it, it prevents data exfiltration because it enforces, even with these platform as a service components, both ingress and egress traffic to stay within your own provisioned virtual private network in the cloud. So even if you are talking from your cloud service to another cloud service in your subscription, in your tenant, you didn't pass through kind of shared public Azure network. You were always within your own network, and you were able to prove it, which is the crucial part. And getting closer to nowadays. So at this point, I think we are doing quite well. We have Defender for Cloud, a new rebranding for Azure Security Center. We got Azure Firewall Premium, which really gave us kind of next generation firewall, 5 to 10 years later maybe, but gave us the functionality to work alongside these different levels of Azure. We no longer have this kind of separate layer 7 Azure networking, and then separate layer 4 networking, but we can actually bring these together. We have one product that we can use to control our containers as a service, infra as a service, as well as a bit on the platform as a service as well. We have that managed identity throughout most of the Azure services. And some slight notes on kind of broader Microsoft security ambitions as well. There was a couple of acquisitions that I want to call out here. CloudSecNext and RiskIQ. CloudSecNext nowadays the permissions management product, and RiskIQ, I think it's Defender for Threat Intelligence. They keep on changing the names in here, but this is basically where Microsoft went into a spending spree on different types of products here. Entra permissions management. Yeah, I have it here on the Microsoft brand. So basically, this is a tool for your cloud identity and access or entitlement, cloud infra and entitlement management. So it's a tool that scans what is your identity and access management posture right now. It listens for a while, what functionality are you really using, and then it proposes this kind of downscaled, what permissions should you need to do exactly the thing that you've done so far, and even can automate kind of create custom roles for you from that as well. GitHub Advanced Enterprise Security. There's even a GitHub Advanced Enterprise Security for Azure DevOps, which is a very funky naming, but basically this is a lot of the SecDevOps tooling, both in-house from Microsoft as well as third-party tooling like credential scanning tooling and IAC scanning tools built into a single package and single license, crucially as well, so that you can tap into your security lifecycle, app security lifecycle there. Defender external attack surface management. Was this actually the RiskIQ? No, this is yet another acquisition. I don't recall the name from here, but this is again does external attack surface management, external attack surface scanning for you a little bit. So great tooling in there, as well as now we have functionality for confidential compute that I mentioned 5 years earlier, not just within virtual machines, which evolved a long time with the hardware vendors there, but also with some more modern tooling as well. So if you had your legacy software, you now have Azure Virtual Desktop to use confidential compute with it, as well as if you're building something new and if you're using confidential containers, you can actually tap into Azure's Container Service Platform, AKS, to use confidential compute kind of across that stack as a service as well. So this is basically how we are looking around nowadays in a somewhat modern environment in Azure. So this is just this is actually one of those standard reference architectures you can download from Microsoft's site. There's a link on the slides that you'll get access to later. There's documentation about which kind of linked into that security baseline, so you get also the compliance view of what is already here out of the box, what security controls are available to you, what can you do to make it better, and how does it map into the standard set of regulations that we know and love and hate. So basically what I have in here is an Azure Kubernetes cluster, Azure Kubernetes service cluster that's in my own controlled network. I have my platform as a service components that it can talk to throughout my private link within my controlled network environment. I have my dashboard or UI for my machine learning developers. I have my container registry hooked up there as well. Everything stays within my network there. I can jump into it as a user through VPN. I can jump into it through a Bastion jump host. And I also get to use my secure Azure pipelines also for the actual deployments as well, also without any credentials that I need to use. So also those self-hosted agents that I can use now with managed identities. Coming into this year, everything is called the Defender now. I don't know what Defender for Cloud was before this, but apparently now we also have Defender for Cloud CSPM. So if you called it CSPM before, you were wrong, like I was. I did this session a while ago, and apparently it's not called Defender Copilot, but we didn't have public names for those nowadays. But at Microsoft Learn, just this week, they announced some actual documentation into this preview. So go and check it out there. And I think I'm on time. So there was an Azure OpenAI reference. The idea is that don't use it directly. Put an API gateway before it, and that's it. We came from default allow everything, ClickOps everything. We got halfway through somewhat kind of ready capabilities in around 5 years ago. Kind of you could do the right things if you wanted to, and now a lot of those right things are actually built in by default there as well. And shameless plug, get my book. It's only 2 years old. Some of the things are still valid, and check out the LinkedIn Learning course as well. Thank you very much.